Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on the recent ScreenConnect vulnerability and how threat actor group Kimsuky weaponized it. Before we get started, I wanted to cover a few housekeeping items. Today's session will be recorded and will be available after the briefing. We're using GoToWebinar for this presentation, and you'll find the client on your monitor. Through that client, you'll be able to submit questions at any time, and our presenter will address questions at the end. Kroll carried out over 3,000 engagements in 2023. This gives us tremendous visibility into what's going on in the front lines and allows us to deliver end-to-end cybersecurity solutions across several different services. We have a wealth of expertise with over 650 cybersecurity experts on the Kroll team who are working around the globe with companies of many sizes, varieties of industries, and we work with over 85 cyber insurance carriers. We are very fortunate today to have leading Kroll expert George Glass join us today to go into more detail. George is an associate managing director on the cyber threat intelligence team at Kroll Cyber Risk and is responsible for ensuring that the latest threat actor intelligence is applied to our proprietary XDR platform used to power our managed detection and response service to clients around the globe. And with that, I will pass it over to George.
Thank you so much, Hannah. So today we're going to cover some very interesting malware that we discovered a little while ago now as part of ongoing ScreenConnect exploitation activity. Throughout this, I know the title is Advanced Malware Threats, and it certainly was advanced malware, but throughout this, one of the key takeaways that I want everyone to sort of really internalize is the detections that we use to catch this maliciousness were not designed to detect malware, the TODDLERSHARK malware that we're going to be analyzing. And that is a key part of defense in depth, which is one of the best ways of countering some of these zero-day and end-day vulnerabilities, of which ScreenConnect was one of them. So let's talk about ScreenConnect. What is it, and what are these vulnerabilities that were being exploited towards the beginning of this year? So ScreenConnect is used by thousands of organizations for remote support, admin work. Sometimes it's used in a B2B environment for, again, remote assistance, things of that nature. And our scans show that at any one time, especially around the time of the ScreenConnect vulnerability going live, which was February of this year, there are about 9,700 instances available on the internet. So the ScreenConnect vulnerabilities were discovered by a Kroll analyst, Christopher Leach, and his reporting basically led to the discovery of two vulnerabilities, CVE 2024-1708 with a CVSS score of 8.4. That's a path traversal vulnerability that can allow a threat actor to execute code remotely on a ScreenConnect server. That's important, and we'll come to that later. The worst of the two was CVE 2024-1709 with a CVSS score of 10. This is an authentication bypass because of insufficient path filtering, and I'll go on to explain that in just a second. But essentially, the combination of these two vulnerabilities allows a threat actor to bypass authentication and then use a zip slip style vulnerability to upload and execute code as system level privileges. So a really, really nasty vulnerability. And in just a second, I'll explain how easy it was to exploit. This affected versions less than 23.9.8, and ScreenConnect worked very, very quickly to build a patch for this vulnerability. So let's take a closer look at the vulnerability itself. The authentication bypass with the path reversal, as I mentioned earlier, allows an arbitrary file upload and the ability to execute code, most likely as some kind of web shell. At the crux of the vulnerability is the ability to bypass some of the what would presume to be sort of hard-coded security measures that are in place to prevent an unauthenticated user from accessing a endpoint called the setup wizard. The setup wizard is only supposed to be accessible to users who have already logged in with a password and who are authorized to add users. However, the vulnerability meant that adding anything after the setupwizard.aspx on the URL bar, such as /foo, for example, that could be literally any character, could even just be a slash, essentially gives you access to the administrator panel. And now, as an attacker, I can just set up an account as an administrator, just as if this was a fresh install. Now, once I use that to get authentication, I can use the zip slip attack that I mentioned earlier to make requests against the install extension endpoint, allowing, as an attacker, to upload a web shell, for example, which executes as a system on the device. So let's take a look at the code and exactly where this vulnerability lied. So the above code is in the ScreenConnect .service.exe, and it's used to check whether or not the setup page, setupwizard.aspx, can be accessed. But the checks that are performed in that regex, which is marked on red in the screen there, context.request.path, are not sufficient in this case. And we can essentially append any string after the ASPX extension, as I explained earlier. Now, there's a number of complicated reasons why this may not have been seen initially. It's to do with how .NET is implemented in this case. But essentially, the crux of this is there's improper checks, and it's an incredibly easy vulnerability to exploit, right? You can just add a slash, literally any characters after that slash, and you have access to the administrator panel. So that's really, really bad. Now, what's always interesting in these cases, especially with a vulnerability such as this, is seeing how quickly it takes threat actors or security researchers as a whole to understand the vulnerability and release POC code. Typically, these are referred to as end-day vulnerabilities. Now, the cool thing about this case is we get to see everything from end to end, from discovery of the vulnerability by a Kroll analyst, all the way through to exploitation by threat actors. So let's run through the timeline. February 13th, we submit the vulnerability report to ConnectWise. And on February 19th, which I believe is present this day in the US, ConnectWise release a customer advisory and a patch. So they alert everyone of the vulnerability, and the patch is released the same day. So a very short time window there to do that patch turnaround. So some really, really good and really hard work obviously is being done there. Now, the next thing on February 20th is POCs already being released. That just goes to show how quickly a vulnerability such as this can be analyzed, and POCs are often released very quickly. Sub 24 hours, that's a rarity, but I think in this particular case, it just part of the fact that it's so easy to exploit meant that it was found so quickly, and there's lots of, it's easy to reverse it, .NET code, etc. And then on February 21st, we already start to see exploitation in the wild. That's a very, very short time frame there. And we start to see APT activity, which is what we're going to talk about today. Ransomware as a service groups begin to leverage the vulnerability. Our caseload starts to increase, and we start to monitor what the threat actor groups are doing. Less than 3 days later, we see the first ransomware deployment observed. So, that's a very short dwell time for a threat actor to leverage the vulnerability for initial access, and then deploy ransomware. And of course, in those cases, when Kroll IR is engaged, the ransomware has already been deployed. And so, walking it back, we can see that February 21st is when the threat actors first gain access, and sub 3 day dwell time in those cases. And it's interesting, we can see sort of the patch cycle as everyone starts to either pull the devices offline or patch their devices throughout the rest of February and into early March. We still see exploitation as late as March 7th But in general, that's a very quick reaction to this vulnerability going live. And on March 7th and around that sort of date, we assess there's more lone wolf actors leveraging that vulnerability rather than sophisticated organized groups. They'd already done the bulk exploitation way back in the middle of February. If you tune into our quarterly reports or seen the quarterly webinar, you may have already seen this slide, but this is something that we emphasize there, and I'll absolutely do that again. In this particular case, there's less than 48 hours to patch this vulnerability. And I think it's fair to say that lots of people take their February 19th as holiday, may not see the notification. And so realistically, before those POCs are released and are being actively exploited, that 48-hour window sort of becomes 24-hour window. And it's a really interesting problem that a number of organizations are going to face, right? This isn't the only time this sort of thing is going to happen, and we need to be prepared for it. The other highly interesting part of this case, at least for us in the CTI team, is just how quickly threat actors almost scrambled to start exploiting this vulnerability. Obviously, having a remote access tool that already has access internally allows very quick lateral movement, is running with high privileges possibly. Immediately, as soon as the threat actors identify that vulnerability is going to be profitable for them, they're going to launch a very, very quick attack. Here, less than 24 hours, we start to see it. And the tale of TODDLERSHARK, which we assess is associated with North Korean threat actor group Kimsuky, is really the tale of a very hastily changed BABYSHARK malware that was designed to be delivered after exploiting this vulnerability. So I'm going to take you through the timeline of how we discovered this, some of the teardown, which Dave Quimman from my team did a lot of work on, and sort of the coordination between the SOC, DFIR teams, CTI, and we were able to get a pretty good idea and understanding of exactly how this attack unfolded. So our first contact was made by our MDR team. It was first alerted on the back of a number of custom detections that we've built, and I'll go into those in just a second. And as I mentioned before, let's just be clear on this, these are not designed to catch advanced persistent threats. These are common TTPs used by commodity malware and more advanced actors alike, absolutely. But they're living off the land binaries that are used by a number of threat groups. And MSHTA we see used a lot. I just recently published a blog post on IDAP loader that leveraged MSHTA for initial deployment as well. And these living off of the land binaries, in this particular case, MSHTA and certutil are very good at catching badness, because threat actors like to use living off the land binaries because it's perceived to bypass detection. But we've had these custom detections in place for a good number of years now, and of course they're still very effective at finding badness. So here's a screenshot from the Sentinel-1 console, and as you can see here, I've just put some of the detections in here, and we can see MSHTA making a connection to that very suspicious looking domain, and we've also got some process creation events stemming from a command line using certutil to encode a file. Again, very suspicious behavior here. That's something that is a really good detection. So let's have a bit of a closer look at the MSHTA command from what the SOC was seeing in the console. So in the process tree here, we can see the ScreenConnect service. It's understood and believed that threat actors have likely had hands-on keyboard access through here. So we see the launch of a command prompt, which spawns MSHTA and some connections as well. And there are a number of sub-processes from the MSHDA, again using cmd.exe, which again triggered a number of other alerts as well. We'll get into those in just a second. But obviously, right from the get-go, this is a highly suspicious attack chain. MSHDA is used to render HTML. It shouldn't really be spawning these things. It can be used to execute VBScript, which we're going to get into. And this is obviously a very highly suspicious chain of events here. And so it was investigated closer. So let's have a look at the payload that was involved in this MSHDA process, this VBScript that it executes. So the MSHDA process downloads a heavily obfuscated VBS script from the suspicious URL that we mentioned earlier. And what we found was this VB script is polymorphic. So it changes each time the file is downloaded with randomly generated functions, names, junk code, variable names, and a hexadecimal encoded payload. Obviously, it's highly obfuscated. Looks really nasty. We've highlighted some of the key functions here in red, but we can go ahead and clean that up a little bit. And here you can see there's a second stage payload URL, and this is also unique in each infection. So leveraging IOC based infection, sure, yeah, that domain absolutely, you'd catch that, but each individual infection gets their own specific URL. And we believe this is because threat actors are individually infecting the machines, and they would understand where to reinfect after the fact based on what is returned by this command that I'm just about to explain. The second stage download is a large hexadecimal string, which then is decoded, and it contains a set of functionalities made up of a few parts, setting Windows registry keys, capturing system information as well. And that is really where we see a lot of the command executions that we saw in the process tree. And this really is sort of indicative of an information gathering tool. We can see it collecting the host name, system info, doing net use, again, potentially another really good detection based on how your sysadmins may use net. We can see here as well, it's getting antivirus information, looking at registry keys and things like that, running task lists, getting network information. And what it's doing is it's appending all of those results into a .acl file with a randomly generated name, and randomly generated each time. We believe that the ACL naming convention access control list is designed to sort of hide the fact of what this is doing. It doesn't make any difference as far as the malware is concerned. And this is essentially what the certutil detection was seeing. That file is then encoded into a .pem file, which we've actually seen evidence of Kimsuky doing before. And then the .pem file is exfiltrated to the C2 server, and then the captured file, so the ACL file and the certificate.pem file are both deleted. It's our belief and our understanding that the threat actors are essentially waiting for those files to come back to them. They'll then look through the information, understand if there's an interesting target in that list, and then using one of the final pieces of the malware infection chain, they'll place commands on their command and control server, which are executed on the victim machine. So the final aspect of the malware is the initiation of this scheduled task. Again, potentially another really good detection opportunity there. And a script is written to an ADS, or an alternate data stream, of a file located in the program data directory. This script also contains a URL that will be requested every minute by the scheduled task. So you can see that there, minute 1. and any response from that URL is passed to execute function and will be immediately executed. Again, we've got some really interesting naming convention here that we can use to tie back to previous Kimsuky infections as well. And we believe that the USO naming convention would look to identify what it would look to sort of hide itself among common system files as well. It's not being particularly stealthy in some of the behaviors that it's running, but it's trying to be stealthy in the way that it's hiding some of these files. Again, using the unique IDs that are generated every subsequent infection, the threat actor will be able to identify which commands, which infected hosts they can send the commands to. Of course, we didn't actually see any of the follow-on commands because the SOC had already put a stop to the infection, so we weren't able to see what the threat actor would have done post-infection in this case. This is a copy of the alternate data stream here, just cleaned up. You can see there the unique ID identifier for these infections, and the response text being passed to execute via the VB function there. So let's go and take a look at some of the overlaps with BABYSHARK and ReconShark, which have previously been used by Kimsuky. One of the more interesting artifacts that was found as part of the list of commands that were run are these references to Excel and Word. Excel and Word play absolutely no part of this infection claim whatsoever. So immediately that was kind of suspicious. Why the threat actor include that? And essentially what this is doing is it's setting VBA warning keys for Word and Excel to a value of 1. And the value of 1 means that untrusted and trusted macros are allowed to run without notification. So that's essentially turning off some of the macro protections in slightly older versions of Office. Now we know that Kimsuky would typically conduct BABYSHARK and ReconShark attacks via spear phishing campaigns with malicious attached documents. And of course, in those cases, it would serve them best to disable VBA warnings so that follow-up infections may happen and so on. So we'll see in just a second that this is very highly likely a reworked or repurposed version of BABYSHARK or ReconShark. And as I mentioned before, the naming of that scheduled task and the files there, the USO stands for Update Session Orchestrator, which is part of Windows. And as I mentioned before, we think that's being used to try and hide the thing and hide amongst legit Windows binaries. Moving over to some open source intelligence, this was reported by Unit 42 about BABYSHARK, and we can see the variant comparison here. We can see those Excel references, those Word references, those VBA warnings being set, and we can also see the USO naming convention. So we believe, based on the reporting from Unit 42 and the stuff that we saw, that this is very highly likely a repurposed version of BABYSHARK, and it appears to be done relatively quickly, as we know, likely in sort of sub 48 hours. And so, hey, you know, there's really no need to execute these, but there's also no need to remove them from the malware. So likely they're just left in. Not only this, but the algorithms used to decode that big hexadecimal at the beginning that we mentioned were very strikingly similar to the hexadecimal decode functions reported by Unit 42. And you can see more about that on our blog post that we wrote covering this on TODDLERSHARK. You can see the direct comparison there. I think that's pretty compelling evidence. We can also check some of these IOCs that we saw, that malicious domain or suspicious domain in VirusTotal. And at the time, what we saw was there was highly, it was being reported pretty quickly to VirusTotal. So we certainly weren't the only people seeing this. We also know that Kimsuky or KTA082, as we name them here on Kroll, have a propensity to use the 000 web host app service, sort of a free VPS host. And we've seen that used in previous reporting of Kimsuky operations as well as part of phishing campaigns. It's very cheap, burnable infrastructure, and again, it's easy to set up and deploy, and likely they've done that in their haste to exploit this vulnerability as quickly as they possibly can. But we saw from this that other people were certainly reporting this suspicious domain, which we now know is malicious. But what that sort of told us is it likely wasn't a targeted attack and more of an opportunistic attack. Likely they were scanning the internet for instances of ScreenConnect being available on the internet, and then attacking them sort of in an opportunistic fashion, running the TODDLERSHARK malware to get an understanding of where they landed inside an environment, and then likely they would do follow-on attacks based on what sort of organization they've been able to breach. And this is just sort of a quick refresher on Kimsuky. As I've mentioned, they're attributed to North Korean cyber espionage group. They employ techniques to gather intelligence in support of the DPRK's strategic objectives. As we've mentioned, we see the use of certutil, living off the land binary, PEM exfiltration as well is a very common TTP reported to be used by Kimsuky. Stealer-like behaviors, BABYSHARK and RECONSHARK, and the use of scheduled tasks for persistence. Those things on their own may not be enough for attribution, but in this case, we assessed that it was highly likely attributed to Kimsuky in this case. So let's go through some of the key takeaways here. There's a fair amount to unpack, and we got to look at some pretty awesome malware. It's always interesting to look at APT activity, but I think there are some key takeaways that apply not just for these sorts of threats, ransomware groups, lone wolf actors, pretty much all of e-crime will look to leverage vulnerabilities, whether they're zero-day vulnerabilities developed by a RAS group such as Clock, which we found that they were doing for a couple of years prior to exploiting the vulnerability and move it. In all of our cases, edge technology continues to be one of the most observed initial access vectors for ransomware. And in Q1, it was the top initial access vector for ransomware groups. It provides them a very easy entry into an environment, and leveraging vulnerabilities essentially means it's less likely that their intrusion is going to be detected from the start, which is why I believe it's so important to have that defense in depth security posture. Defense in depth in this case enabled our SOC to quickly identify the threat, understand that there was definitely something malicious going on, and using the EDR technology could immediately isolate that host and begin to perform remediation straight away. Although there may not be detection opportunities for the initial access vulnerability, and this could be any edge networking technology vulnerability, the defense in depth meant that once the threat actor was able to move away from that endpoint further into the corporate environment, they were detected and kicked out of the environment. So we talked about how threat actors are very quick to leverage end-day vulnerabilities, vulnerabilities that have a patch available that may not necessarily be patched yet. we're seeing a lot of vulnerabilities this year that are sort of exploited within the first week, 2 weeks of reporting. And in this case, I think maybe one of the more extreme, but nevertheless, I mean, it happens. So we should definitely use it as a teaching moment. There are cases where there's going to be sub 24-hour exploits released, and patching in less than 24 hours or even 48 hours in this case, if you weren't working that holiday weekend. Patching is unrealistic for most organizations at that sort of cadence. So it's really important to tabletop these scenarios based on this sort of threat intelligence of previous cases like this one, and develop and test playbooks to be able to respond to those sorts of events. For instance, is it better to just pull the service? Could you just pull the service for a week, still carry on business as usual, maybe with a few slight changes, or do you need to deploy that patch immediately? How would you do that? All of those things are very, very important to be prepared for. And speaking of defense in depth, as part of the blog post, and just as a sort of an idea of where these behavioral detections came from, we provided this list. So yeah, you can take a screenshot of this if you like, or go to our blog post. But as I mentioned way back in the beginning, none of these detections are designed to stop APT activity, right? These are living off the land binaries, certutil, MSHTA, PowerShell executing encoded commands, PowerShell spawning CMD. All of these things led to the detection of the threat, and some of the behaviors that the threat actor was doing. And so again, you don't need to be detecting super advanced Win API usage or anything like that to effectively defend yourself against something akin to this that's leveraging those kinds of methodologies. And in so doing, you're also covering a lot of TTPs that are often executed by e-crime actors, ransomware groups, and so on and so forth. I think that's all we have today. I think there's some time now for some questions. I don't know, have we had any of those come in?
Awesome, thanks, George. Yeah, we do have a few minutes for questions, and just a reminder to everyone, if you do have questions for George, please paste them in the chat and we'll try to get to them now. One that did come into the chat, that's a good one, is, George, would you recommend detecting on things like ipconfig and netstat?
Yes. Yes, so ipconfig and netstat are tools that are going to be used by system administrators, sometimes even users if they need to troubleshoot their device, things like that. On their own, they're not a great detection. They're going to be really noisy and generate a whole bunch of false positive alerts for the SOC to handle. But in combination, certainly that could be indicative of some strange activity going on, especially if it's running on a device where you wouldn't expect that sort of thing to happen, like a terminal, a reception, or something like that. And so yeah, I think that's one of the key things there is, maybe you could build a detection where all of those commands were running in a very short amount of time, like it was being executed by a script. Sub 10 seconds, all of those commands run. That may be a good detection methodology there. So yes, it may be worth detecting on them, but just in the right circumstances.
Awesome, thanks. Sort of a it depends situation.
A little bit.
Another one, are you seeing vulnerabilities become more common or more prevalent?
Yeah, I think there's a little bit of a step change over the last couple of years for the way that vulnerabilities are publicized because of the exploitation that we're seeing by high impact events like ransomware, and potential sort of third-party threats of someone else happens to be running this piece of software and now my files are stolen. I can go back to the case of Move It. about this time last year. Certainly this year, we've seen some really nasty vulnerabilities, very high on the CVSS scale, sort of 9s, 9.8s, 10s. And there are some really, really clever people out there that can do a very quick patch reversal and understand how to exploit the vulnerability, and they'll do so quickly. And we see chatter about vulnerabilities on the underground very soon after there's some official announcement about a patch coming out or something like that. So I think, yes, we are seeing a lot of easily exploitable vulnerabilities, especially in the last few months. I seem to remember at the beginning of the year we were sending out a lot of vulnerability alerts. It certainly feels like it. I think it's because threat actors are leveraging them so much. Going back to some of our statistics, it was one of the most used initial access methods was some sort of edge networking technology, and a good proportion of that was leveraging some kind of vulnerability in the edge network technology as well.
Great, thanks, George. I don't see any other questions coming through, so a big thank you to everyone that has taken the time to tune in. We hope you found this session informative. Once again, thank you all for joining today, and thank you, George, for this presentation. We hope to see you again at one of our future briefings.